You're listening to a download from the BBC. This is from our own correspondent, introduced by Kate Adie.
Today, Mitt Romney triumphs in Texas, but it could mean more hostile scrutiny for his Mormon faith. The Indian people, once labelled untouchable, say they still face prejudice 6 decades after discrimination against them was officially outlawed. A mum in Havana names her daughter after a brand of tinned meat. We find out what's in a name in Cuba. And can it really be the last gasp of British imperialism? The UK's 3-pin electrical plug takes China by stealth. So, after months of often bitter campaigning, the former governor of Massachusetts, Mitt Romney, finally secured the Republican nomination this week. He'll challenge Barack Obama in November's US presidential election. During the primary campaign, much attention was focused on Mr. Romney's Mormon faith. Studies show that Mormonism, a religion founded in the 1830s and now followed by 14 million people around the world, is often misunderstood. But if non-Mormons wonder about Mitt Romney's suitability for the presidency, what do Mormons themselves make of this historic moment? Paul Adams has been to Salt Lake City to find out.
A lot has been said and written about Mormons recently. Hardly surprising given Mitt Romney's inexorable progress towards the Republican nomination, or the fear expressed by many evangelical Republicans that his faith is little more than a cult, or the fact that Mormons, just 2% of the population of the United States, now seem to be prominent in walks of life as diverse as politics, sport and pop music. But for all their varied successes, the image of Mormons is anything but diverse. Straight-laced, teetotal, family-oriented, but fundamentally odd. That, basically, is how most Americans view followers of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It's an image that's hard to shake off. For sure, there is something uniform about the sweet young sisters, drawn from all over the world, who guide visitors around Temple Square, the very centre of the Mormon world. Those demure frocks and sensible shoes, the quiet, smiling, earnest certainty of the super-faithful. But it's a long way from the sisters at the temple to the playwright James Goldberg. With his long dark hair and beard and piercing eyes, he looks like a prophet. But it's not Mormonism that made him that way, it's his combination of Jewish and Sikh blood. James told me a story of sudden prejudice. He and a colleague were rehearsing a musical in his friend's Lutheran church. The pastor came by and, thinking James was Jewish, engaged in a lengthy peroration on the joys of interfaith dialogue. Finally, when James could get a word in edgeways, he pointed out that while he was proud of his Jewish roots, he was in fact a devout Mormon. It was, he recalled, like night and day. Gone was the talk of dialogue. Now the pastor was jabbing his finger and asking why it was that James believed all this Mormon nonsense. Looking back on it, he was able to see the funny side, but that's not how it felt at the time. Suddenly, James said, he didn't feel welcome at all. That evening I met another unconventional figure. I'll call her Jennifer, since she spoke to me with remarkable candour, but on condition that we remained off the record. She said she was deeply proud of her Mormon heritage, but wished the church still had the radical, nonconformist edge that characterised its origins back in the religious ferment of 1830s New England. The sort of nonconformism that resulted in the Mormons fleeing west to avoid persecution, that set them off on their own journey to the Promised Land, much as their Puritan forebears had done a little over 200 years earlier. When did you stop being radicals? I asked her, wondering how it was that their colourful, dangerous founding fathers, Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, had somehow morphed into the square-jawed, rather less threatening figure of Mitt Romney. When we stopped being polygamists, she replied, matter-of-factly. It was a move forced on the church in the late 1800s in return for statehood. A few die-hard polygamists still hold out. Jennifer doesn't want to be one, but she admitted to a certain nostalgia for the old nonconformist ways. She loves the Mormon story, with its mystical revelations, its flawed founder, and epic migration. And she regrets that Mormons eventually became, in her words, more Victorian than the Victorians. Despite the church's prohibition on alcohol, by the way, beer is produced in Salt Lake City, albeit not by a Mormon company. Rather provocatively, one of the best brews is called Polygamy Porter. The slogan on the label, "Why just have one?" It's a joke that long-suffering Mormons have been living with for quite a few years. The Mormons I met in Salt Lake City are used to being talked about, joked about, and defined by others. And they know that with Mitt Romney's rise to prominence comes a whole new round of scrutiny, much of it hostile, much of it poorly informed. Not all of them want him to be president. I met plenty of Democrats during my visit. But they all see this as a big moment. They celebrate the fact that a Mormon now stands a reasonable chance of entering the White House. This might just be, some say, the moment when Mormons finally feel accepted, just as Catholics did when one of their own, John Kennedy, was elected president in 1960. But they're also wary. What if Mitt gets it all wrong, they wonder? Will Americans simply blame it all on those crazy, not-quite-Christians from Salt Lake City? In times of economic difficulty, a famously wealthy Mormon politician has a lot to prove, a lot resting on his very square shoulders.
Paul Adams in Salt Lake City. Discrimination based on caste in India was supposed to have been done away with under the Constitution of 1950, yet complaints about prejudice continue. The Dalits, traditionally regarded as untouchables, make up more than 15% of the Indian population, and some will tell you they've benefited from the efforts made by the state to improve their lot. But Natalia Antalava's been finding out that many claim they're still routinely discriminated against when it comes to jobs, schools and places where they can eat and pray.
The cup flew across the room, straight into the wall. A dozen or so men suddenly stopped drinking their tea. Before anyone spoke, Dr. Vinod Sonkar threw money on the counter, enough for both the tea he drank and the glass he had just smashed. The men stared at him as he walked out. Dr. Sonkar tells me about his life over ice-cold drinks in his apartment in Delhi. Growing up in a dirt-poor Indian village, he says, wasn't easy. But the really hard bit was being beaten by teachers and peers at school, then humiliated and teased at university. Although by the time he went to get a drink in that tea shop in Rajasthan, Dr. Sonkar had turned his life into a success story. He had a PhD and a teaching position in a prestigious New Delhi university. And yet, as the shop owner handed him his cup of tea, he asked him what caste he belonged to. "I'm a Dalit," Dr. Sonkar said. In that case, the shop owner replied, "Wash your glass when you are done." He didn't want to touch whatever I have touched. I made it impure. I am the untouchable, he says. Dr. Sonkar's postgraduate thesis compared the struggle of India's lowest castes to that of the civil rights movement in the US and the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. The sort of discrimination you see in India, he argues, is the worst. And yet, he says, the Indian government, predominantly made up of the upper caste, has successfully convinced the international community that caste discrimination is an internal cultural issue. India's 1950 constitution banned the practice of untouchability, in which members of India's higher castes will not touch anything that has come in physical contact with the Dalits, the lowest caste. But in reality, the practice is alive and well, especially in rural India. Recently, an organization called Video Volunteers, which employs dozens of activists in remote rural areas, gathered evidence of untouchability from across the country. None of the footage is particularly dramatic, but the routine humiliation that it depicts is shocking. Videos show women who are forced to take their shoes off as they walk in front of houses of the upper caste, Dalit children who are made to eat separately from their classmates during school lunches, villagers who have to walk for hours in the heat to find water because they are not allowed to use public water taps. In India, untouchability has many faces. It's like you're born with a stamp on your forehead and you can't ever get rid of it, says Amit, one of the video volunteers in Haryana. Amit's village is set amid rice fields, only a 3-hour bumpy ride away from the capital. We walk through the dusty streets, past children playing by an open sewer canal. It's a ghetto of sorts. Everyone in the neighborhood is a Dalit. Amit doesn't know any Dalits who own land. He says it's hard to to escape from poverty. Untouchability locks people in the professions that they were born into. For example, even if a waste picker can afford to buy a cow and sell milk or open a shop, an upper caste customer will not touch anything he sells. Untouchability denies Dalits not only opportunities, but access to temples, water, education, sometimes even medical treatment. Dr. Sonkar says he completed one of his degrees via a correspondence course because he found teasing in the classroom so unbearable. Over the years, there have been many suicides among Dalit students in colleges across India. Today, Dr. Sonkar is the only Dalit professor at his university. I ask him to name me an influential Dalit academic. He can't. A big-name journalist? There isn't one, he says. A Supreme Court justice? 2 out of hundreds appointed in the last 65 years. Dalits have worked hard to increase their political power. Several states have now had Dalit chief ministers, but most find it almost impossible to get jobs in the media, justice system, the police. In Sanskrit, Dr. Sonkar tells me, the word Dalit means suppressed, smashed, broken to pieces. 65 years after Indian independence, he says, we're still Dalit, still broken, still suppressed.
And that's Natalia Antelava. Now, how annoying is it that the British electrical plug never seems to work anywhere else in the world? And if you've forgotten to pack that widget claiming to be an international adapter, you're completely skewered. Even in a century when it's taken for granted that everyone depends on electrical and electronic appliances, there's still no single global standard for voltage or for the kinds of plugs and sockets you have to use. Every nation seems to have its own idea of what a plug should look like. But now it seems there might be light at the end of the tunnel. The normally grumpy traveller, Peter Day, has returned from China full of praise for something he encountered there. And here is his plug for a plug.
I have to report a minor breakthrough in the great power play between nations, and a very pleasant one at that. Any global voyager burdened by electrical equipment will have been hugely frustrated by the rabid protectionism of the international electrical plug and socket industry. It's almost as insistent a badge of nationhood as having your own national airline, an electrical plug that will fit only into an electrical socket designed by an intricate-minded national to be utterly impervious to other countries' plugs. Thus we have flimsy American 2-pin sockets, sometimes splayed in other countries, 2 round pins in continental Europe, with German ones apparently minutely further apart than in France to frustrate the electric shaver. There are also mighty British 3-pinners with an enormous earth socket that seems rarely to be used, themselves a 1950s replacement for several curious smaller 3-pinners which must have dated back to the days when electricity was invented. Australians and New Zealanders have their own 3-pin plugs to keep the Poms and everyone else at bay. This plethora of standards probably goes back to the beginnings of public electricity in the late 19th century and the battle between AC, alternating current, and DC, direct current. The great American electrical pioneer Thomas Edison stood for DC. His rival George Westinghouse was in favour of alternating current, as developed in Europe. One of the considerations was the relative safety of direct current. The first electric chair seems to have been built and then used to prove that alternating current was more of a killer. After that, plugs became a national peculiarity, as cartels of national manufacturers drew up proposals for plug designs that met the safety standards of the day and kept overseas competition at bay. Well, all this is a rather long-winded way of expressing my delight the other day when I found in my bedrooms in 2 new hotels in China a simple all-purpose socket that took the plugs of many nations, including those of the UK. I have not encountered it before in years of travel. Wonderful no longer to have to struggle with those converters that never exactly fit or fail to have a vital hole or pin, and it's normally discovered only when a shave is vital or a flat battery urgently needs to recharge to enable recordings to continue. Oh, what pleasure to plug in my British 3-pin plug the other evening in Inner Mongolia, so very far from home. Why is this now possible? It seems to be a new application of the one country, two systems policy first applied to shapes of government when Hong Kong was handed over to China in 1997. Since China now includes Hong Kong, Hong Kongers travelling to their own land needed to be able to use the 3-pin plugs they inherited from all those decades of British rule, instead of the 2- or 3-pronged flat Chinese plugs. So the UK 3-pin plug has taken China by stealth in a last gasp of British imperialism. What a slogan! One socket, two nations, or even one socket for all. In the wake of this minor triumph, I have a modest proposal to make. Surely it is now time for the world's statesmen and women to turn their attention to that other source of electrical irritation, the humble light bulb. Most British homes are still struggling with the new low-powered, energy-efficient bulbs that are often too big for the old-fashioned shades that don't fit them anymore. But the fittings are twofold: the ancient UK standard bayonet or the newfangled continental screw-in bulbs. UK-style bulbs must have lost their monopoly under a twin-pronged assault from overseas, the bureaucratic requirements of the European single market, plus the rise of the mighty continental retailers in the UK. They brought their own fixtures and fittings with them, screw-in bulbs and all. So most British homes are now required to carry a stock of two completely different kinds of light bulbs, twice what people need on the continent, or in the screwed-in USA. It is expensive and inefficient. In the gaps between trying to save the Eurozone, diplomatists and politicians of Europe could embrace a new cause. Let them convene a World Light Bulb Convention with the aim of ushering in a new enlightenment. If the Chinese can stoop to acknowledge the existence of the British electric plug, then surely the peoples of the world should also be ready for the proud democratic concept, one light bulb for all. Or maybe, to put it into Mandarin, many systems, one bulb.
And that was Peter Day. And thank heavens I'm not the only one who hates the new light bulbs. Next to Cuba. Now, of course, we know about the vintage American cars and the cigars, the palm trees and the lilting music. But now the islanders, it seems, are becoming known for their extraordinary names. While many other Latin American countries have stuck to a rather traditional and limited repertoire of names drawn from the Spanish, Cuban parents have been flamboyant and far more innovative. It's now relatively rare to come across a plain old Jose or Isabel. Instead, you're more likely to meet people whose names have roots in classical mythology, communist geography, or are just the result of imaginative wordplay. So, what you call a Cuban, Sarah Rainsford's been finding out.
As a journalist in Cuba, posing certain questions can be tricky, but I never thought asking a person's name would be one of them. My problem is I hardly ever understand the response. And it's not just because I'm English. My Cuban colleagues are often just as baffled. It turns out it's rare to encounter a simple Maria or a Miguel these days. Instead, parents choosing a baby name like to let their imagination run riot. You should talk to her, the headmistress laughs when I wander into a local primary school and tell her I'm curious about Cuban names. It's home time and children are charging out of the former Spanish mansion, pinafores akimbo and neckerchiefs flying. The head points across the courtyard to a young teacher perched on a child's stool. Her name, she says, is Danasis. Oh, sorry, how do you spell that? I'm forced to ask, and she tells me, no doubt well practiced. It's a combination of my parents' names, the teacher says. They're Danielle and Daisy, so that makes me Danasis. There's one pupil in her class called Old Danier. That's her father's name, Reynaldo, in reverse. Another, Zulkari, was named after the star of a long-forgotten foreign soap opera. It's all getting too much for some. Amongst the statistics, stories about vegetable crops and the baseball scores in Cuba's youth newspaper, I recently came across an interview with an academic. She was calling on hospital staff to guide parents better when naming their newborns, warning that saddling children with a name they're constantly forced to explain risks causing what she called moral damage. And yet the urge for originality isn't new here. Immediately after the 1959 revolution, there was a surge in the number of Fidels, Rauls and Ernestos. But in the 70s, imaginations really began to fly. That's when the letter Y, rarely used in Spanish, became a hit, with Cuban parents competing for ever more exotic-sounding creations. Ulieski, Humilis, Yaraleidis. Even normal names were hijacked. Daniel became Yaniel. It was an intriguing drive to be different in a country where the state now controlled everything from education to diet through the ration card. Perhaps it was a small assertion of autonomy, or an attempt to cling to some Caribbean colour in an increasingly uniform communist world. It was about being original to match the times, an elderly writer, Jaime Saruski, assured me, surrounded by huge piles of sun-stained old books in his flat in the once smart neighbourhood of Vidado. A plaque downstairs identifies his building as the launch pad for a failed attempt to seize the presidential palace in 1957 and assassinate Cuba's pre-revolutionary dictator, Batista. The fashion for names with a Y faded over the years, but other trends have followed. There was Dancizi, for instance, Mr. Saruski recalled, of the era when parents liked to distort foreign words. That meant they could dance well. Then there was Dayesi, that's yes in 3 languages, he laughed. However wild the choices, though, no one here remembers any interference by the authorities. And as for any moral damage now, it seems it's not the pupils who are suffering. It's really complicated when you first get the list of names for your class, the young teacher, Danesis, admitted. You don't always know which are boys and which are girls, and then getting the spelling right is a nightmare. Round the corner from her school, local residents hover in the doorways of their crumbling old Havana homes, gossiping and crowd-gazing in the hot afternoon sun. "Eddie Murray, come back here," a mother shouts after a little girl who's run off, clutching a paper cone of sugary pastry. At least no other child looks round. Further on, I meet one man called Pablo and one Ernesto, complete with a Che Guevara tattoo on his forearm. But such orthodox choices are definitely the minority now. There's people here named after ships that have visited Cuba. A young woman called Yamilesis tells me approvingly. Usnavi from US Navy is perhaps the most famous. And then I meet Noslenis. "It's Nelson, my dad's name, spelt backwards," the girl explains at my raised eyebrows. "I don't think that's strange at all," her mother shrugs, and I turn, hoping for enlightenment at last. "My own name's Maylene," she says. "My mother named me after the canned meat that we Cubans used to get on our ration card."
Sarah Rainsford in Havana, Cuba. Politicians have to be more careful than most about what they say and do. Their every word is recorded and scrutinized, their every gaffe and U-turn widely reported. And this is particularly true in the Scandinavian countries, where people can be on first-name terms with their representatives who are expected to display total transparency in matters like tax returns and business affairs. Jake Wallace-Simons was reminded of this on a recent visit to Sweden, where the Prime Minister is one of several politicians who've been making the news for reasons not of their own choosing.
A single error can have far-reaching consequences, both in political life and on the football pitch. In Sweden, the Prime Minister, Fredrik Reinfeldt, of the centre-right Moderate Party, recently found himself in the sort of hot water that will be only too familiar to many politicians in Britain. In a classic gaffe, he carelessly used the term ethnic Swedes. This provoked widespread accusations of racial intolerance. Meanwhile, in Malmö, Sweden's third largest city, Mayor Ilmar Reepalu has been having problems of his own after making comments that were perceived to be anti-Semitic. This, commentators have suggested, has exacerbated racial unrest in the town. It was against this strife-ridden backdrop that a football match took place in Stockholm between the England Writers' football team and the Swedish Writers' football team. It's a little-known fact that writers group themselves into national teams and play football against each other. Many end up injured, as writers are not generally used to strenuous physical activity. Invariably, there are comic moments, and, notwithstanding occasional moments of acrimony, writers' football games are, on the whole, perfect examples of diplomatic harmony and cultural exchange. I, having had the honour of representing England since the team's inception in 2006, played in midfield until I strained my calf in the 60th minute. Before kick-off, a rumour went round that a controversial Swedish politician by the name of Thomas Bodström was going to be playing. This was worrying. Thomas Bodström had started his adult life as a professional footballer in the Swedish First Division. This was before he became a lawyer, and that was before the Prime Minister, impressed with Bodström's legal abilities, rang him up out of the blue to offer him the position of Justice Minister. Thus began a 10-year political career that was fraught with scandal. Last year, Bodström quit frontline politics altogether to focus on writing thrillers. He also began to find solace once more in the beautiful game, easily securing a regular place in the Swedish writers' football team. Thankfully for England, Bodström was injured and played only for the last 10 minutes of the match. This enabled us to hold the Swedes to a 2-2 draw, the perfect diplomatic result. True to form, the game was entertaining and bizarre, involving two identical goals, one for each team, in which the ball went in straight from a corner kick, and one particularly outrageous handball, which, in the spirit of the game, went unpunished. That evening, I found myself sitting next to Bodström at dinner. Up close, there was no denying his charisma. He was tall and muscular with chiselled Nordic good looks. Yet there was something jaded about him. Before long, the conversation turned to the topic of political scandals. "I never planned to become a politician," he said, ruefully. "I came into the job completely unprepared. Journalists investigated everything about my life. They found out I'd smoked marijuana, and that I once made a tiny error when paying my taxes, an oversight of only about 500 kroner, about £50. But I'm human. Who hasn't made mistakes? Politics is a very difficult world." Bodström has indeed had it harder than most. In 2010, he admitted on the radio to having smoked marijuana in the past. He had been tipped as the favourite to be his party's next leader, but shortly afterwards he left political life altogether. After dinner, Bodström got us into the exclusive Riche nightclub, which was full of beautiful people there to see and be seen. I spoke to him very little after that, but I do recall asking him if he regrets not having been better prepared for the tough old game of politics. "Well," he replied, "politics was okay. I had fun, but nothing beats football."
Jake Wallace-Simons, and good to know that that calf strain of his did nothing to inhibit his nightlife.
You're listening to a download from the BBC. This is from our own correspondent, introduced by Kate Adie.
Today, Mitt Romney triumphs in Texas, but it could mean more hostile scrutiny for his Mormon faith. The Indian people, once labelled untouchable, say they still face prejudice 6 decades after discrimination against them was officially outlawed. A mum in Havana names her daughter after a brand of tinned meat. We find out what's in a name in Cuba. And can it really be the last gasp of British imperialism? The UK's 3-pin electrical plug takes China by stealth. So, after months of often bitter campaigning, the former governor of Massachusetts, Mitt Romney, finally secured the Republican nomination this week. He'll challenge Barack Obama in November's US presidential election. During the primary campaign, much attention was focused on Mr. Romney's Mormon faith. Studies show that Mormonism, a religion founded in the 1830s and now followed by 14 million people around the world, is often misunderstood. But if non-Mormons wonder about Mitt Romney's suitability for the presidency, what do Mormons themselves make of this historic moment? Paul Adams has been to Salt Lake City to find out.
A lot has been said and written about Mormons recently. Hardly surprising given Mitt Romney's inexorable progress towards the Republican nomination, centre of the Mormon world. Those demure frocks and sensible shoes, the quiet, smiling, earnest certainty of the super-faithful. But it's a long way from the sisters at the temple to the playwright James Goldberg. With his long dark hair and beard and piercing eyes, he looks like a prophet. But it's not Mormonism that made him that way, it's his combination of Jewish and Sikh blood. James told me a story of sudden prejudice. He and a colleague were rehearsing a musical in his friend's Lutheran church. The pastor came by and, thinking James was Jewish, engaged in a lengthy peroration on the joys of interfaith dialogue. Finally, when James could get a word in edgeways, or the fear expressed by many evangelical Republicans that his faith is little more than a cult, or the fact that Mormons, just 2% of the population of the United States, now seem to be prominent in walks of life as diverse as politics, sport and pop music. But for all their varied successes, the image of Mormons is anything but diverse. Straight-laced, teetotal, family-oriented, but fundamentally odd. That, basically, is how most Americans view followers of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It's an image that's hard to shake off. For sure, there is something uniform about the sweet young sisters, drawn from all over the world, who guide visitors around Temple Square. The very pointed out that while he was proud of his Jewish roots, he was in fact a devout Mormon. It was, he recalled, like night and day. Gone was the talk of dialogue. Now the pastor was jabbing his finger and asking why it was that James believed all this Mormon nonsense. Looking back on it, he was able to see the funny side, but that's not how it felt at the time. Suddenly, James said, he didn't feel welcome at all. That evening I met another unconventional figure. I'll call her Jennifer, since she spoke to me with remarkable candour, but on condition that we remained off the record. She said she was deeply proud of her Mormon heritage, but wished the church still had the radical, nonconformist edge